what you asked for. Heavy is the crowd, fire in the sunrise, ashes raining down. Try to hold it in, but it keeps bleeding out. This is what you asked for. Heavy is the crowd.
Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is time for the bracket stage of Worlds 2024. We are down to our top 8 teams. We are done with the Swiss stage, and it's time to jump into our best of 5s. We're kicking it off here on day number 1 with a bit of an LPL civil war, but we'll be covering every single series as per usual on this channel. If you want to know my thoughts on how we got here, how the Swiss stage has gone, even how play-ins have gone, you can check out the Worlds playlist up in the iCard. We've covered every single game at this tournament so far. Of course, we've also covered every single game that every single team left in the tournament has played the entirety of this year. We've covered all 4 of the major regions every single week, so you can check out any of that on the channel if you are interested. But today we are going to be going over our first quarterfinals matchup, talking about the 2 teams and seeing who the first team to qualify for the semifinals of Worlds will be. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well, but I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. Let's go ahead and jump right into the analysis. There is a lot of good stuff to go over. Of course, with a best of 5, it means we're going to be going even more in depth on each game. But if you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in our first quarterfinals matchup, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game. And of course, at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will quickly be talking about the bracket afterwards, but we did kind of a full bracket preview at the end of the final day of Swiss, so check that out if you are interested in my thoughts on how I think the rest of this bracket is going to go. But most of today will be spent talking about our first quarterfinal series, so I'm very excited to get into it. We can look at the bracket here. Of course, the 8 teams that qualified from the Swiss stage, of course, 4 of them, half of them being LPL teams, all 4 of the LPL teams getting out of the Swiss stage. That's the second year in a row that has happened. 3 of the 4 LCK teams, and then 1 little North American team that has snuck their way out. You know, the Reddit thread about how, with 8 monkeys at the tournament, at least one of them is going to make the quarterfinals. That happened to be FlyQuest this year, so congratulations to them. But today we get a bit of a civil war matchup and kind of a fraud off if you were to ask a ton of LPL fans over the course of this year. It is going to be a matchup between the number 3 seed from the LPL in LNG Esports and the number 4 seed from the LPL in Weibo Gaming. I'm really intrigued to see where this ends up going because these 2 teams have actually been very, very different throughout a majority of this year. Not in terms of playstyle, they're both very similar in terms of playstyle, and hell, they're even similar in terms of arc, but neither of them have been all that consistent in terms of how they've been able to get there, and oftentimes it's actually at the expense of each other that one of them ends up thriving. When you look at how LNG has played for a majority of this year, you look at them struggling quite a bit at the beginning of summer, not really being able to find their footing. Spring was definitely a bit of a challenge for them. They started to find something towards the back half of spring, but as I said a lot during the LPL analysis, their schedule got way easier in the back half of spring. It felt like this team just wasn't clicking. Weiwei and Scout in particular just seemed to have basically negative chemistry jungle mid. Like, Weiwei wanted to fight and skirmish all the time in the early game, and Scout is just not a player who really thrives in an environment like that. He wants to play these long, drawn-out games. He wants to try to play for these late game team fights, and he wants to get a lot of resources in the mid game, and it just didn't necessarily seem to fit for LNG. What really started to unlock this team was Weiwei actually taking much more of a background role for them domestically. He would start playing a lot more tanks. He would start playing a lot more passive in terms of his early game, start playing into that style that Scout was a lot more familiar with, that Scout had won a world championship with, and all of a sudden things started to turn around for LNG. Scout got back into MVP kind of caliber form once he was playing his style again, and the team had a very clear idea. You have players like Gala and Hong down in the bot lane that are going to be super consistent regardless of the style that ends up being employed, and Zika in the top lane was actually really good, in my opinion, in the back half of the summer split when you're talking about that second stage. And so you know, I was starting to feel pretty good about LNG, and then they go into the playoffs as the number 2 seed, and they don't win a single playoff series, and you're starting to feel frustrated because it's not entirely surprising for this team because that's kind of what they had been for a lot of this year, but they looked like best of 3 frauds. They looked like a team that couldn't necessarily live up to some of the expectations and the hype that people had for them, but then they go to the regional qualifier, they play this Weibo Gaming team, which we'll talk about in a second, who just come off of the summer finals, and they obliterate them. They 3-0 them, they get to Worlds, and they've not yet dropped a game. team at the World Championships. They're 4-0 in terms of their games here, and so it's just really difficult to get a read on LNG. This is a team that I would expect to struggle at the very least a little bit in best of fives, just kind of natural when the team has one play style and doesn't necessarily like to deviate all that much from that play style. If you can take them out of their comfort zone, that's going to be a very easy way to make them a bit less effective. But for Weibo on the other side, this is a team that went to LPL Summer Finals. This was a top 2 team in the LPL in the summer split, obviously not in terms of the regular season, and they still had to try and qualify through the regional finals, which was not ideal. The regional qualifiers, they go to 5 games against JD Gaming. They end up getting that 4th and final spot. Would have been crazy if they ended up missing it after making finals in summer, but that's due to their own results. In the spring split, they go for a big roster overhaul, and it really works out. Bringing Tarzan in was a huge boon for this team. He was a huge positive for Weibo, definitely the best player on the team over the course of, the entirety of the summer split, I would say. And then you're looking at players like Light, who have been exceptionally good recently. I think Crisp has had a decent tournament so far, even if he's going to get a lot more hate than he deserves because his plays are really aggressive. He's very volatile, but I think that kind of works for Weibo's style more than it does for other teams. You do have some concerns. I think Breathe, while he has been good at Worlds so far, has not necessarily been great throughout the entirety of this split. He was a concern domestically. He had one of his worst splits ever domestically, and then Zhao, who I think had his worst year ever, at least in terms of an overall package of his game. I've been pretty heavily defending him over the course of the last few years because his team fighting has stayed really good, but they have been winning in spite of him, I would say, throughout a majority of this year. He was okay in the playoffs, and he's been pretty okay at Worlds, but this is definitely an intriguing matchup for a couple of reasons. Of course, Weiwei, obviously formerly of Weibo Gaming, last year when they made World Finals, Tarzan and Scout had played together on LNG last year, and I think that there was a lot of storylines surrounding that because both of them received quite a bit of blame from the other team's fan bases for why the team ended up not working. And so I do think there is a lot to talk about in terms of storylines going into a series like this, but at the end of the day, I think it's really going to come down to how these games end up playing out. I think a lot of people would look at 2 LPL teams and say that it's naturally just going to be an aggressive skirmish-oriented series, but that doesn't favor LNG. That's not really the style that they feel comfortable playing. The longer these games go, the more they get drawn out. I think the better that's going to be for LNG, where Weibo is really going to thrive in a lot of these early skirmishes, but we'll see. The only way to know is, of course, to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So, without further ado, let's get right into our first quarterfinal series. The winner of game number 1 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0. A very important game to win and a best of 5 to establish a precedent. Having that momentum, having that, I guess, confidence would be a proper word here after that game number 1 is gigantic, especially for these two teams who can both be rather swingy, and this was a very swingy game. I think both teams drafted basically the opposite of what I talked about in my preview here. LNG drafting a very aggressive dive comp that wants to try to take advantage of early and mid skirmishes. Weibo Gaming wanting to scale a lot more consistently. They have this big wombo of Skarner and Orianna and even Gnar to an extent, Rakan. Like, you really want to find these 5v5 team fights later on in the game. I was a little bit worried about Weibo because I just didn't think they had a lot of tools to be able to take advantage of the lane swaps. LNG have some things that I think have worked really well at this tournament so far, but as we saw, the later on this game went, the harder it was for LNG to be able to execute, and they make one gigantic macro error, and the game is over. Like, you can't really afford to make those kinds of mistakes in the quarterfinals. Weibo Gaming is able to capitalize. They get the Baron. They're able to push everything in to the LNG base, and all of a sudden, there's just no way for LNG to be able to recover that. They lose one team fight and the game is over. Like, it's a really quick end and it's a really quick turnaround, but that's what it takes at this level, especially with comps like this. Player of the game for me is going to go to Tarzan in the jungle on the Skarner. I really didn't consider much else for this. I think Breathe is definitely in the conversation on the Gnar as well, but Tarzan was really the facilitator of the entire map, I would say. He was the one consistently looking for a lot of these aggressive plays. Now, sometimes they were way too deep. I think people are going to point to him, diving in and getting that double ult on Weiwei towards the back half of that, I believe, 3rd dragon fight, where it ended up just being catastrophically bad for Weibo. They should have just gotten the dragon and gotten out. Zhao, who ends up getting picked off, and then eventually, Weibo ends up getting picked off for going way too deep, and that's really not ideal. But outside of that play, I think Tarzan was pretty consistently in the right place at the right time, prioritizing the right objectives, most notably a lot of these dragons, which made it a lot more difficult for LNG to play out the back half of this game. It forced a lot of these 5v5s, which is basically exactly what Weibo would have wanted going into these circumstances. I think Tarzan did a really good job of controlling the map, and eventually the Skarner did become very relevant in a lot of these fights. He was really, really important on the final day of Swiss. He was only averagely important, I would say, through the first 8 or so days of the Swiss stage. He was still valuable, of course, but as a first pick, I always thought he was a bit overrated, especially because his value seemed to be a little bit harder to execute in the back half with how short range he is. But that final day of games, and now that we're seeing teams that are actually consistently very good play him, I'm definitely starting to see the value that Skarner brings that other champions just can't really bring. B1 Skarner is definitely making a lot more sense to me now, and Tarzan is a big reason for that. But Breathe was the other player that you definitely have to point out here in the top lane on the Gnar. Just abused Zika in the 1v1, and even outside of that, just adapted to the lane swap so much better. He was up like 40, 50 CS at parts in this game, like 2 or 3 levels. Like, he solo killed Zika on the top side. It genuinely was a bit of a disaster for the Renekton. We know LPL teams are very partial to that champion, so I imagine that at least somebody's going to be going back to it, but Gnar looks so much stronger as a champion right now, and generally speaking, Breathe has felt very comfortable at the World Championships. We'll see if that continues, because he was not better than Zika domestically, so that's going to be huge for Weibo if he can step up and continue to be a really big positive presence. You were also seeing a lot of aggressive engages coming out from both of the bot lane members on Weibo. Crisp obviously trying to find those flank angles, you know, the thing that he's very well known for, the creative engages. He'll sometimes take a chunk of his health to kind of set those up, but for the most part, it's actually worth it in a lot of cases, because if he does land those engages, it often is just like game ending. And Light was very consistent. He was constantly hitting arrows, constantly at the very least looking for plays to make. It didn't always go perfectly for him, but again, it just needs to go well enough, and I think it did. Xiao, who wasn't great this game on the Orianna, just didn't really have any damage and wasn't really able to follow up, but they could win without him. Weibo was pretty solid here in game number 1. Want to see them have a slightly more consistent early game, but understanding the weaknesses of LNG, forcing that Baron towards the back half of the game was a great call, and it ended up actively winning them the game. And then for LNG on the other side, I don't know what happened here. You just completely collapsed mentally. When Weibo starts Baron and trades it, because, you know, they're like, screw it, if you want to stop us getting Soul, if you want to stop us getting that final dragon, then we're just going to take Baron, and then LNG dropping dragon, walking up to Baron, watching it die, not doing anything, and then just walking back down to dragon and hoping that you still have tempo, but instead LNG have Baron empowered, or Weibo Gaming, I should say, have Baron recalls, and they're out on the map, and they're able to push in top lane, and they're able to push in mid lane, and you lose basically everything for that decision. Like, I can't imagine what is possibly going through your mind when you make a call at this stage. You absolutely have to commit to it. You can't back out in the way that LNG did, and it completely cost them the game. They already don't really have a great 5v5 comp. They don't really have a great ability to be able to defend the line if they are going to be picked off by Weibo, or if they're going to lose their gold advantage. And so the moment that you basically give over everything that Weibo could have wanted, you not only give them Baron, but you give them all the pressure on the map. The game is genuinely over at that point, regardless of what you had done leading up to it. That makes dud of the game very difficult, because I don't think anybody on LNG individually played miserable. I'm going to have to give it to Zika in the top lane, because he was just so far behind in the early game, although he did a fantastic job to recover and be very useful in a lot of these fights. I just don't really have anybody else that I can give it to. The dud of the game is the shot calling in the macro from LNG. That was the part of the game that brought them down and lost it for them. And so I do think LNG have the tools to be able to recover. Scout actually played really well in this game on the Ahri. I thought that his ability to move around these fights and find really interesting side angles was huge. Weiwei was excellent in this game, and quite frankly, he's been very good at this tournament for LNG, and if the mid jungle is going to continue to be solid in the early game, that's probably going to be an LNG series win. Gala and Hong were generally fine. I don't love Ahri plus Jhin, because I just don't think it's enough damage right now in the current meta, but if you have a gold lead, it's very difficult to play into, and so I can understand the idea behind it. I just think LNG, again, took themselves out of their own style. This is a team that wants to 5v5. They want to try to find a lot of these big fights in the back half of these games, and yet they draft a comp that's not necessarily super conducive to that. And so we'll see what ends up happening moving into game 2, but Weibo with the early lead here. Can they hang on to it, or is LNG going to be able to even things up and tie us up going into game number 3? Well, the winner of game number 2 was LNG. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up the series at 1 apiece, and another very sloppy game coming in from both of these teams. This has not exactly been the peak of execution so far to start off the quarterfinals, and that's not really what you would have expected between these two. I mean, the peak of execution is not certainly something that these two teams are familiar with, but they probably were a bit better than this throughout a majority of the year. It just feels very not clean right now. It's very difficult to describe describe why these games are going so poorly for both of these teams, but it ends up in a situation where the gold lead ends up fluctuating quite a bit throughout this. I think it's a very easy game to end up describing. I think this is an absolutely ginormous draft gap in favor of LNG. I think Weibo Gaming willingly giving over Yone, Sejuani, and Jax, and even the Ezreal on B4, it's just completely unacceptable to answer with Aurora, Amumu. It's just an absolute disaster. You're answering the Jax with Cassante. You know, Jax, of course, famously having the armor buff on this patch. It just feels like Weibo have absolutely no idea how to draft in this current meta. It feels like every team against LNG is just giving them free draft wins, and yet Weibo had so much better execution throughout all of this game. They were so much better in terms of actually fighting things out, being patient, understanding where they need to be on the map, that they probably should have won this game. But again, it all comes down to one major mistake. They overpush. They try to end the game when they don't really have the resources to be able to do so. They end up getting, I think, like 4 for 2'd in the enemy base, and they can't really end up coming back from that. That gives LNG Mountain Soul, which means that Yone and Jax are now completely unkillable. Jax in particular is now completely unkillable as he dives onto your backline and flanks you every single fight, and you don't have the damage to ever be able to break through. It was a miracle that you were in that position in the first place. LNG had to make some catastrophic errors around the Baron in order to even give you a chance to be in this game, and they did, but you threw it right back to them. So we'll talk about it. Like I said, ginormous draft gap in my opinion. I don't think this game is playable for Weibo if LNG just plays this out completely normally. I think obviously you have early game pressure here with the Ezreal. You should be able to win in the lane swap because Amumu doesn't really have any way to play pre-6. He doesn't really have any way to skirmish against like Sedge coming down bot lane and making life for Ashe a lot more difficult. You've also got the Yone, which can do things around the map if you really want to do it, but your levels 1 to 3 should be relatively strong here. And then once you get into the later half of the game, there is no stronger trio in the entire game right now than Jax, Sejuani, Yone. There just is not a better, grouping of 3. I think if you're Weibo, if you're happy to make the Yone Aurora trade, which I never am, I still think it's an absolute disaster, then you need to take the Jax as well. You cannot get away with giving them Jax, Sejuani, Yone. It's a disaster class and how to draft on this current patch, and LNG kind of proved that, but there were some mistakes. Zika is going to get player of the game here on the Jax, though. I think the parts of the team that were strong were very strong. Zika, Scout, Gala, I think they all played relatively well in this game. Weiwei, I thought had really good moments in this game, but Zika was definitely the star here, was able to get super fed in the early game with a couple of really big skirmishes. The moment that this game starts spiraling out of control early, that Jax and Sejuani start getting accelerated in terms of the resources that they're getting, I really don't think there's a lot of ways back into it for Weibo, and Jax is just one of those champions that keeps his foot on the gas so effortlessly. Zika definitely having a nice bounce back after what I would consider a very rough early game in game number 1. I don't think anybody is really going to dispute that. Couple of massive ultimates coming in from Scout later on in the game to hit 3 or 4 members. Yone is just so consistent. I really don't understand why teams are so willing to give this champion over, especially as a trade for Aurora. Aurora can do a ton, but Yone is so inevitable. It is so impossible to actually shut this champion down. Like, he wasn't behind in this game, but even if he was, Yone does so much damage with so few items, and he is so generally useful because of his kit that, I can't wrap my head around the idea of giving over this champ. It continues to be a massive problem for every team that makes that decision. I can't imagine that teams playing into Yone have a particularly good win rate this tournament. I have to imagine it's close to like Yone's having a 80-85% win rate right now. I mean, it's an absolute disaster to give this over with his best 2 partners. Weiwei was fine, I would say, in the jungle, but Gala, I think, played some of these later fights really well. It took him a bit to get online in terms of being able to take over in these 5v5s. He was actually way too aggressive for my liking in the mid part of the game, and it put him in a relatively bad spot, but eventually starts to get to the point where he's cleaning up a lot of the fights that Jax and Yone end up starting, and Hung was generally fine on the Leona as well, missed a couple of ultimates, but that was more so on Weibo dodging rather than him being bad. Overall, I think LNG was not great in this game, if I'm being honest. I think their scorelines are probably better than what you would indicate their gameplay would be, if only because their champions are so strong, their comp is so strong, but this is a draft win. This is very much not an execution win, because Weibo continues to just out-execute them in these pivotal moments. I mean, Weibo should have won this game. Again, kind of talking very similar to what we said in game number 1. The team that lost basically threw it away with some really bad decision-making. Once again, Weibo completely outplays LNG at the Baron fight. There's really no reason that LNG should ever be losing that. Weibo is so so patient, and they utilize the Aurora ult perfectly to be able to zone way out. They're able to get the Baron and clean up the fight. It's a beautiful play there from Weibo, but then they overextend trying to end the game with Mountain Dragon spawning in 30 seconds. They end up losing the fight, giving over Soul, and now they can't actually play. They can't actually fight. It just seemed like a completely unforced error from Weibo that they absolutely did not need to make, and it cost them the entire game. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Tarzan. It's funny, our player of the game and Dud of the game got switched from game number 1, but I'm just such an Amumu non-believer, right? Like, I really do not believe in this champion. I certainly do not believe that, oh, it's okay, it's okay that we give over Yone and Jax, that, you know, we can give them that big combo because we have Amumu. It just doesn't feel right to me. It doesn't feel like it makes a lot of sense. You don't have any way to punish in the early game, and Yone and Jax are relatively inevitable on this patch. And even in the late game where you are supposed to get this big wombo with like the double circle, like the Aurora ultimate, the Amumu ultimate, hell, even combo that into like a Renata hostile takeover, like I can understand the vision behind that. That is such an ambitious way to play the game, and if it works out, it's really because the enemy screwed up. And I really don't agree with this idea of drafting. I think Weibo put themselves in such a hole coming out of the draft that there basically was no way to be able to salvage it. I do think that there were some positive plays here. Xiaohu was really good in this game on the Aurora, was doing so much for the team. It just wasn't enough. Breathe was actually pretty fine on the Cassante as well. Even with Jax getting that armor buff, Cassante has proven to still be okay into Jackson, just okay in basically every matchup. But, you know, Light basically having to use Cleanse on cooldown because he's so far forward. Crisp never really finding that perfect hostile takeover. Weibo's execution was really good in the moments that it mattered, but again, their decision making just ends up, you know, being what bites them. And really what it seems so far in the first 2 games is that whoever throws harder is going to end up losing the game. Whoever makes a worse macro error is going to end up losing the game. It's not about playing better. It's about not making that game defining error. And you know, it's a very interesting thing to talk about in the quarterfinals. But the series is now tied up at 1 apiece. We're moving into game 3. And as you guys know, I think game 3 is the most important game in the series. I think making sure to put yourself in a position where you only have to win 1 of the final 2 games is so crucial to making sure that you're in a good spot in the back half. So who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Weibo Gaming. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, and we just can't have one normal game, can we? It's all going to be about who ends up having a lead in the last couple of moments, and whoever that is going to end up losing the game. That is the only constant that we have seen throughout the last 3 games, is it doesn't matter what happens in the early game, and hell, it doesn't even really matter what happens in the early late game. All that matters is that whoever is going into the final team fight with a lead ends up losing. It's genuinely absurd how bad the Barons have been for basically everybody throughout this entire series. LNG had one good one in this game, but outside of that, it has been an utter disaster, and once again, the game entirely flips on its head, this time in favor of Weibo Gaming. It's frustrating because I was going to come in to this segment and really praise LNG's macro. I was going to be like, well, they've clearly learned from the first 2 games. They've clearly cleaned up a lot of the things they've needed to. They had a couple of plays in this game that I thought were terrific. Them being able to secure that first Baron was excellent. I think they played that out about as brilliantly as you can, with Zika in the side lane being able to pull Light down in order to stop him from taking inhibitor turret and Breathe and likely inhibitor, but that leaves Baron wide open. That is such a genius play. I think you played the map incredibly well, being able to capitalize when, you know, Weibo wanted to trade Baron for, like, a dragon. LNG would just push down on the top side and be able to create a numbers advantage and get a free kill for Gobla. Like, you were just creating so many opportunities, and it felt like the macro was finally there. It felt like you were actually able to win team fights. Honestly, it just felt like this game was locked for LNG, that this was going to be the first one that wasn't going to be completely flipped in the back half of the game, but yet, here we are, and this is after Weibo actually had a really big lead in the early game, being able to get a ton of gold onto their solo laners, and so it's just a wild experience. All 3 of these games so far have been a blast to end up watching, and honestly, I hope the rest of the series is as interesting as these first 3 have been. But let's get into the analysis. Player of the game is going to go to Xiaohu. I don't think a lot of people are going to argue this all that much. He was the reason that they were in this game in the first place. He got mega fed early on here. Just a lot of really great plays. He ends up landing a beautiful shockwave on the top side. And from that point onwards, there's really no way for LNG to easily be able to deal with the Orianna. They even overextend in a lot of instances, giving him even more gold. He was sitting at 5 or 6 kills at 17 or so minutes into the game. It really felt like the Orianna was going to completely dictate the tempo of how the rest of the game goes. But one really big fight later, and, you know, some really good macro from LNG, all of a sudden they have complete control of the game. All of a sudden they have quite a bit of gold onto Weibo and onto Zika, and now they can play their side lanes. They can play for these picks. And, you know, LNG does a great job at that. They end up extrapolating that gold lead, I would say, into something much larger than what Weibo probably should have given them for free, but there's really no way for Weibo to initiate a lot of these fights. It takes a while for Tarzan to get online in terms of his items and his resources to be able to frontline, and so you're relying a lot on Crisp being kind of a primary engage tool for the team, and it's just very difficult to do that and also stop the Jax in a lot of instances, and so you land in this position where you don't really have a lot of agency, but again, just one disastrous fight at the end of the game in the Baron pit for LNG, where they're basically entirely out of position and they can't recover. That's the game, and Xiaohu obviously a big part of capitalizing on that, but Breathe was gigantic in that final fight here on the Gnar. He feels very comfortable on this champ. I would do everything I can if I'm Weibo to keep him on Gnar throughout the rest of this series. It's a very safe blind pick. Obviously, there are answers, but I don't think Zika is going to play something like Yasuo. It just doesn't really feel like something that LNG would want to play for on the top side of the map. Outside of that, like Breathe, you know, Gnar is actually very unpunishable, I should say. Breathe has been excellent on the champion throughout the entirety of his career, and he's been really good throughout this series so far, and, you know, we saw it in the final team fight. I mean, he was able to answer incredibly well. I also think Light did a great job throughout most of this game. Now, the ultimates were definitely not ideal, but his positioning was super consistent. And I know a lot of people are going to say that I maybe undervalued Gala in the previous game on the Ezreal. I certainly tried not to. Like, he was really good in the back half of the game. I think that there were some mistakes in the mid game, but, you know, his late game damage was ridiculous. I think Light has, you know, definitely struggled to have the same kind of impact in terms of damage in a lot of these fights, but this team is prioritizing Ashe super early on in all of these drafts for a reason. They think she's very versatile, and they think she can fit into a lot of these different types of comps, and, you know, at least so far, they've kind of been correct. I also really like Crisp on Braum. I think this is one of his best champions. I think we've seen that throughout the tournament. He's able to play super aggressive on Braum and able to step up in really, you know, interesting ways. Maybe he's not the playmaker that you would see on something like a Rakan, but he actually fits the team mold really well. I think Tarzan took a while to get online, but again, once he did, he's Maokai. Like, Maokai does the Maokai thing, long range engage. It's very simple. So for Weibo, honestly, I'm just happy that they were able to win this game. They, again, are walking out of a win and not feeling particularly good about it, but at the end of the day, a win is a win, and for LNG, a loss is a loss. This is kind of a disaster. Losing this game should be completely unacceptable, and it's not like a draft thing. I think this draft is very balanced for both of these teams. Both of them have clear strengths and weaknesses, and I think, honestly, either could win the further this game goes, but this was your game to lose in terms of the gold lead. I mean, you completely threw it away at the final fight. Hong is going to get my dud of the game. Obviously, the scoreline looks miserable. So many of those deaths were just him sacrificing himself after the team took Baron, or, you know, got some sort of objective, him getting caught out, getting vision, etc., etc. So I'm not going to sit here and like harp on the 0-7-3 scoreline. I don't think that's quite indicative of, you know, his gameplay, but I think the 3 kill involvements is very indicative of his gameplay. I just think he didn't do anything this entire game. He's getting dud of the game not because he died a lot, but because he basically failed to participate in any of the actual important fights throughout this and was really not relevant throughout a majority of the game, and that's really not good as the Alistair. You need to be a big piece in the back half of these games. I also think that there is a reasonable case that you could give this to Scout, who just was doing no damage in the back half, but I think at that point you're really just like nitpicking. I don't think LNG individually played bad up until that final fight, which makes it very difficult to try and identify players that need to get better, quote unquote, moving in to game number 4. But they're down 1-2 now. Their year is on the line here in the quarterfinals. They went into this as favorites for a lot of people. They had beaten Weibo the last time these two teams had played, and now they are down to their final life. Can they win game number 4 and keep this series alive, or is Weibo going to take that game number 4, shut out the possibility of a 5-game series, and continue this back-to-back run in back-to-back years where they're going on long world stretches? It's going to be interesting to see, but we'll find out now, because the winner of game number 4 was Weibo Gaming, they are going to take game number 4. They are going to take this series 3-1, and they will be moving on to the semi-finals. This is starting to look a lot more familiar for Weibo Gaming fans. Honestly, the overall storyline of this tournament so far is not really dissimilar in any way to what they went through last year. A lot of struggles in the Swiss stage, really kind of being pushed to their brink, even by teams that you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be pushed by, you know, Fnatic. But still making it out of Swiss, making it into the quarterfinals, not having a ton of expectations, but being able to come out on top in their first matchup. This one obviously a lot harder than last year with NRG, but still being able to win their, you know, quarterfinals matchup and potentially meeting a team like Billy Gaming in the semifinals. It's such an interesting kind of repeat of history with Weibo Gaming moving on, but unfortunately, this does mean the end of the year for LNG. I'm just going to come out and say it. It is such a massive disadvantage to go 3-0 in the Swiss stage. I tweeted this out as we were watching these games. I'm sure you guys have seen it because you all follow me on Twitter, right? Link in the description, obviously. But it is such a massive disadvantage to go 3-0 in Swiss. These guys haven't played a main stage game in 2 weeks, and it's, you know, they're even the lucky ones, right? Gen G, who we'll talk about obviously later on in the quarterfinals, it'll be like 15 days between their last Worlds game and their first quarterfinals game. It's just a ridiculous amount of time. It is such a disadvantage to not be playing on stage, to not be adapting to the meta that is developed over the back half of the Swiss stage, and it really puts you in a position where you just have to hope that you're so much better at the game that you can afford to not have as much experience as the team that you're going into, which is not really what you want to see in the quarterfinals, and LNG is just not good enough of a team to be able to adapt over that. Typically speaking, if you guys know me, you'll know that I'm very critical of giving up the Yone Aurora trade if you're on red side. I just don't think that in most cases it's a good idea. I do think Weibo got the best possible scenario here, though. I really criticized them in game number 2 because not only did they give over the Yone, but they gave over both Jax and Ezreal, specifically the Jax, which I think is a gigantic mistake, letting LNG have what is basically the Exodia comp for this current patch, which is Jax, Sejuani, Yone topside, and then Mandarin Ezreal on the bot side. It just didn't seem entirely fair, and so bouncing back for the red side here to see the Yone Aurora trade, but this time you yourself pick up the Jax and you're able to get the Ezreal on R3. I think this is a much more well-rounded draft. I think there are a lot more options, and Weibo scales infinitely better in this game than they did in game number 2, which is why I feel better about it than I did game number 2. I'm not just trying to go based off of results. Weibo already was outplaying LNG in that second game. They just didn't have the comp to be able to keep themselves afloat, but they had options here, and as much as I'm talking about the Aurora and the Jax and the Ezreal, player of the game for me in game 4 is going to go to Crisp on the Rakan. He was exceptionally good in this game, and once again, I just don't think people are talking about him enough. I've hyped him up a lot over the course of this tournament. He was rough at Worlds last year, but he has been really good for Weibo over the course of their Worlds run this year. I think he's a big reason why this team is still very much in this tournament. Light and Crisp, I think, have been the strength of this team over the course of Worlds, and Crisp continues to be a dynamic series closer. He has been exceptionally good in the final games of a lot of these series. You can look back at Game 3 against D plus Kia. He was my player of the series for that whole series, and then obviously here in game number 4. But player of the series as a whole, for me, pretty much has to go to Xiaohu. I don't think it can possibly go to anybody else. The Orianna game in game number 3 followed up here by the Aurora in game number 4. Both of these games were exceptionally good from him, and to see Xiaohu really performing at Worlds, that puts a lot of faith and confidence in me that Weibo actually can make some sort of miracle run happen. I've been saying it for a while. I've said it all year long. In fact, I've said it about 100 times already at Worlds. This Weibo team is better than the Weibo team last year. I've been like, that's just, they are. They are more complete as a team. They've been more consistent over the course of this year, and last year they made World Finals. I mean, the miracle run is very much on the table, and Xiaohu being in good form right now and actually playing well at Worlds is a big reason for that, but we got to talk about it. I mean, Tarzan was the problem, right, LNG fans? You know, I've been a huge Tarzan defender this entire channel's history. I've been a big defender of a lot of these facilitative types of junglers, Peanut, Tarzan, Karsa, you know, players that I've gone to bat for a lot in the past, but Tarzan has really become probably one of my favorite players in the world, to be a bit biased, and to see him go over to Weibo after being scapegoated so much on LNG for, you know, just a lot of different reasons, for not being the style that LNG or LPL fans wanted to see, to go over to Weibo, to be an MVP caliber player on Weibo and be kind of the vocal leader on them the entire year, to be able to adapt going into Worlds and be more of a secondary presence rather than being this aggressive early game carry that he's been the entire year because the meta has shifted. He's just such a versatile player. He is so good for any team to have, and this has got to feel pretty cathartic for him after being scapegoated so much by the community last year, to be able to go up against your former Oregon, to be able to take them down to move on to the semifinals of Worlds, certainly not bad. But Breathe was also exceptional in this series. They took him off the Gnar, but you gave him the Jax, and that's arguably just as bad here. Jax is in just such a strong position, by far the best top laner in the game at the current moment, as we kind of projected going into this tournament, or at the very least, we thought it was a possibility going into this tournament. It's just ridiculous how much this champ can do if you can get on the backline during team fights. It's very difficult to end up dealing with him, and boy did he break up some of these late game team fights. And I can't believe I'm talking about Light's Ezreal last. This is his best champion. It made it so much easier to play out a lot of these fights. I think if you're able to get Ezreal in this meta, I think you can make a strong case that he is just straight up the best AD carry in the game at the current moment, or at least the most consistent. It's hard to know because, Chinese players just play him better. There's really no other way to say it. LPL players are just better at Ezreal than everybody else, but this has been Light's best champion his entire career. To see him pull it out here, I was shocked they were going to the Ashe so much at the beginning of the series. I think they finally realized they themselves can pick the Ezreal. They don't have to just give Gala the option to play Ezreal. So overall, really, really good game here from Weibo. This was the most dominant game of the entire series, and they earned their way into the semifinals. They were the better team for sure. And then for LNG on the other side, this has to feel very disappointing. Like I said, it's got to feel frustrating to go 3-0, 4-0 really, in the Swiss stage, and then not play games for 2 weeks and come back on stage and just be expected to, be as good as you were. I do think that you had a good read on the meta, and I like the ideas behind a lot of your drafts. I think in this game, you just have to get an early game lead. Like, I understand, full AD is not necessarily an ideal set of circumstances into things like Maokai and Rakan and Jax. It's especially with the Jax armor buffs going into this patch, but I think this is winnable if you are able to actively win in the early game, if you're able to play around Renekton and Yone and really get your solo laners ahead and get the top side rolling. The problem is they just really weren't able to do that, and if you fall behind with this comp here, it's really difficult to end up playing out. Weibo scales so much more effortlessly, I would say, into the late game, which I think they learned the hard way, but Weiwei is going to get dud of the game. I actually think Weiwei was really good at this tournament. I'm certainly not going to criticize him too heavily. I've been very critical of Weiwei over the course of really his entire career, even going back to his Billy Gaming days, but I think this tournament was one of the more consistent, large events that we've ever seen him play at. I think he played better at this Worlds than he played at last year's Worlds when he made World Finals, and so it's how the cookie crumbles. I think Zika really struggled when he wasn't given early game leads. It didn't really seem like a good time for him when he wasn't on the Jax. When he had to play against the Jax, it didn't necessarily go well. Gala and Hong never really got going. The Jhin is entirely useless if he's not able to get going in the early game. He's never going to scale well in a game like this, and Hong really couldn't get on anybody in terms of a lot of these engages. Scout finds a miracle ultimate on 3 members in this random fight in the jungle, but by that point, you're down like 10k gold, and there's really no salvaging the game. It's just for the stats. Like, the KDA looks good, and I'm sure the damage looks good, but Scout didn't really do anything important in this game outside of that gigantic engage. And so overall, for LNG, it's obviously frustrating to go out in the quarterfinals, but this is a relatively okay result for the organization considering their pre-tournament expectations. I'm sure they went into this series with the thoughts and the expectations that they could actually compete and that they should be moving on to the semifinals, that they, would have a chance to be making the finals, to be that miracle LPL team of the year, but unfortunately it just wasn't meant to be when it came to this roster, and they're going to have to go back to the drawing board once again. But for Weibo, the miracle runs just keep coming. Last year was just the beginning. Like I've said 100 times, I think this team is better. 2024 is better than 2023. They're 1 game away from making World Finals in back-to-back years. This org always seems to overperform, and, after another really good showing, who's to say they can't do it again? All right, but that is going to do it for day number 1 of the quarterfinals here at Worlds 2024, our first series, and it is done and dusted. We know our first semifinalist, that of course being Weibo Gaming taking down LNG. They will take on the winner of tomorrow's series between Hanwha Life and Billy Gaming. That's obviously probably the most interesting of the round 1 matchups. T1 Top Esports is certainly a fun one, but HLE, BLG is, those are 2 tournament favorites. It's the number 1 seed from the LCK taking on the number 1 seed from the LPL. What a matchup. The winner obviously moves on to take on Weibo Gaming. As I talked about in my preview at the end of the Swiss stage, I think HLE should have this. They've looked better throughout this tournament, but I already would have thought this was going to be close going into this tournament. I had BLG obviously edging out HLE. They were number 2 in my tier list, and HLE was number 3 in my tier list, but, things have changed a little bit. I think BLG has a really poor read over the meta. I think they've been really greedy, and I think this is worst case scenario in terms of their round 1 draw. Whoever moves on, though, to the semifinals is going to be favorites against Weibo. I think both of these teams should theoretically be able to take care of Weibo relatively easily. Obviously, you never really know. With a lot of these things, Weibo has some weird voodoo magic that they're able to utilize, but it's going to be interesting nonetheless. But let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Do you agree with me that HLE are the new favorites, or should I have stuck to my pre-tournament rankings with Billy Gaming? Let me know down in the comments section below. But that's gonna do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we'll be covering the rest of this tournament, the quarters, the semis, the finals, all of that stuff, and of course, off-season content coming right around the corner. So many teams are already announcing so many different moves. Even teams that were here at the World Championships are already announcing some roster changes, so a lot to go over. If you're interested in that stuff, just a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all